Yeah.
Good evening and welcome to the review of debate. My name is Akash. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who know who we are, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to our club, we're a debating society and online publication where we aim to answer the questions of our time. One of those questions that we're going to be discussing in a panel today is, what does the opioid crisis mean for America? And what are the causes? Where can we go from here? And we have an excellent panel to discuss exactly that. One must only look towards hydrocodone to understand the nature of this crisis. Hydrocodone is a narcotic known for its ability to treat pain. It is also known for being highly addictive. In 2015, the International Narcotics Control Board found that Americans made up 99.7% of the world's hydrocodone consumers. According to the CDC, life expectancy in the US has declined for 2 years consecutively for the first time in nearly 50 years. And many experts point to the opioid crisis facing America as its leading cause. Estimates indicate that opioids will kill 52,000 Americans this year alone, and up to 500,000, 500,000 in the next decade. In the 2017 New Yorker article, former president of the FDA, David Kessler, stated that few drugs are as dangerous as opioids. And last October, the White House declared the opioid crisis a nationwide public health emergency. Our panelists will explore what this means for American life, why opioid-related deaths among younger Americans are at such an alarming rate, what the potential solutions are to curbing the epidemic, and more. I'm privileged to announce all three of them today. First of all, Dr. Lipi Roy. Dr. Lipi Roy is an internal medicine physician board certified in addiction medicine as well as clinical assistant professor at the NYU Department of Population Health. She is currently the medical director of the Kingsboro Addiction Treatment Center in New York, operated by the New York State Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. In her prior role as the chief of addiction medicine for NYC jails, including Rikers Island, she oversaw substance use treatment and recovery efforts for the nation's second largest jail. Previously, she was a primary care doctor to Boston's vulnerable homeless population, among whom the leading cause of death was drug overdose. She also served as an attending physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Roy completed her medical and master's in public health degrees at Tulane University School of Medicine and School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, followed by internal medicine training at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Roy is a strong advocate for public service, and in addition to caring for incarcerated and homeless men and women, she has served the underserved in Nicaragua and India, as well as New Orleans residents affected by Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Roy has also provided medical relief to earthquake victims in Haiti and volunteered in the medical tent at the Boston Marathon. She currently volunteers at the New York City Medical Reserve Corps. She has appeared on CNN and Charlie Rose, has been published in the Huffington Post and Stat News, and has been featured in the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and Oprah.com. Dr. Lipi Roy. Is that all right? So sorry. I'm just going to introduce everyone at the same time, and then we'll invite Dr. Roy to start her presentation. That's okay. Next, we have Sally Friedman. Sally Friedman is the legal director of the Legal Action Center, a non-profit law and policy organization that fights discrimination against individuals with criminal justice histories, substance use disorders, and HIV/AIDS. Since joining the center in 1993, Ms. Friedman has litigated numerous anti-discrimination cases, including Innovative Health Systems v. City of White Plains, a federal lawsuit establishing the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits using zoning laws to exclude facilities serving people with disabilities. Ms. Friedman has worked extensively to reduce barriers to medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction. She authored the 2011 report, Legality of Denying Access to Medication-Assisted Treatment in the Criminal Justice System, and co-authored the 2015 report, Medication-Assisted Treatment in Drug Courts Recommended Strategies. Ms. Friedman has conducted dozens of trainings nationwide and written extensively on anti-discrimination and privacy laws. Prior to joining the Legal Action Center, Ms. Friedman worked as a litigation associate at the New York law firm of Kramer, Levin, Naftalis, Nesson, Kamen, and Frankel. In 1991, she is one of our own. She graduated cum laude from the New York University School of Law, and in 1981 graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown University. Ladies and gentlemen, Sally Friedman. And lastly, NYU's own Mark Kleiman, one of America's foremost public policy scholars. Professor Kleiman is Professor of Public Policy at the NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management. At Marin, he leads the Crime and Justice Program. Prior to joining NYU, he served as Professor of Public Policy at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. previously taught at Harvard's JFK School of Government, and served as a visiting professor at the University of Virginia Batten School, and as the first Thomas C. Schelling Professor at the University of Maryland. Kleiman is also an adjunct scholar at the Center of American Progress and has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. Professor Kleiman was a legislative aide to Congressman Les Aspin in 74-75, a special assistant to Polaroid CEO Edwin Land, 75-76, and from 77 to 79, he was the Deputy Director for Management and Director of Program Analysis for the Office of Management and Budget at the City of Boston. Between 79 and 83, Professor Kleiman worked for the Office of Policy and Management Analysis in the Criminal Division of the United States Department of Justice, and from 82 to 83, he was the Director of the same office and a member of the National Organized Crime Planning Council. Professor Kleiman attended Haverford College, graduating with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics with honors, Philosophy with honors, and Political Science with high honors. For his graduate education, Professor Kleiman attended John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, earning a Master's in Public Policy in 1974 and a PhD in Public Policy in 1983. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kleiman. And lastly, tonight's moderator, our Vice President, Hunter Nash. Hunter is a senior studying public policy in the College of Arts and Science on a pre-med track. A prospective biomedical science master's degree is incoming for him later this year, and he plans to be a pediatrician one day, serving kids all around the United States. Hunter, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Akash. Thanks, everybody, for coming. The more I learn about the opioid epidemic, the more I get frustrated, the more I want to learn about what can be done. And so I think that a panel like this is good for everybody to get a real well-rounded understanding of what's going on and what we can all do, because it affects so many people in this country. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Roy's presentation.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So, first of all, I am so honored to be speaking before all of you. Tremendous gratitude to Hunter for the invitation, and it's an honor to be on such an esteemed panel. If I do my job right over the next few minutes or so, hopefully you'll get a sense of just how deeply passionate I am about this topic. All right? And so I know there are a lot of you folks here that are very social media savvy. I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Facebook as well. So, all right. So let me introduce you to this gentleman. I first met Brian when I was a primary care doctor to Boston's homeless population. Depressed, frustrated, and struggling with severe neck, shoulder, and back pain, Brian just said, Dr. Roy, I can't take it anymore. I need help. In addition to his medical problems, Brian also had just lost his job, and he also just lost custody of his son, which drove him deeper into depression. Frustrated, anxious, well, ashamed actually, ashamed but desperate, he started to use heroin to relieve his pain and suffering, and he just couldn't stop. Sadly, Brian's story is not unique. It turns out that the leading cause of death amongst my patients in Boston's homeless population, was drug overdose. And when that data came out in 2013, it completely transformed the way that I provided care. More about that soon. So, as Hunter alluded to, this is a problem that affects the entire country, and in fact, globally. So this is what the country, I don't know if we can dim the lights at all, but this is what the country looked like back in '99, okay? The red spots indicating overdose deaths per 100,000. And then a mere 15 years later, this is what the landscape of the nation looked like. And I'm sad to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that that's 2014. Today, in 2018, easily 60 to 70% of that map would be dark red. And you guys probably already know that drug overdoses take more lives than traffic accidents and gun homicides. So how did we get here? How many people have heard of Purdue Pharmaceuticals? Yeah, this is an intelligent audience, so I figured that was about easily 80%. Okay, so they introduced a medication called Oxycontin in 1995. Purdue also funded over 20,000 educational programs, and they provided financial backing to the American Pain Society, which came up with the Pain is the Fifth Vital Sign campaign, and they funded the Joint Commission. That's an organization that trains people like me, young doctors in training. Of note, in 2007, Purdue Pharma was fined over $600 million for deliberately misleading the government, doctors, patients, regulators. So this is also a case of really good intentions gone wrong. In the late 90s, doctors were pressured to address this pain as the fifth vital sign. Doctors were also told that opiates are addictive, and they were told that treating pain chronically with opioids is evidence-based. Both points are patently false. Now, granted, there were some bad apples. There were definitely some doctors that took advantage of the financial incentives. They were misprescribing, but that was really the minority. Truth be told, most doctors learned very little about pain management during medical school, during training, and even far less about addiction. Look, I went to some really great schools, but everything that I'm telling you today has been on-the-job learning. So, I just told you about Oxycontin, I mentioned heroin, I mentioned other drugs, but I'm here to tell you that those aren't the real causes of addiction. Remember, back to my patient Brian, let me share with you the addiction tree. You guys familiar with the addiction tree? I saw this online and then I kind of modified it to make it my own. So, as you can see here, there's a whole bunch of, obviously there's the substances, right? Tobacco, alcohol, opiates, or, gambling, then smartphone. I have 3 of them. Bread, Oprah, bread. But who doesn't love bread, right? I love bread. Caffeine. How many of you already had at least multiple cups of coffee today, right? And then my vice, of course, donuts, sweets. And I did not put up a donut because I'm Canadian. I just happen to love all types of sweets. But again, I'm here to tell you that while there are many different types of addictions, the actual individual items or behaviors are not the cause. Think about people who just went through a divorce, death of a child. You lost your job. You were physically abused by your spouse, sexually assaulted, abuse when you were a child, neglected, fire, hurricane, earthquake. I evacuated from Hurricane Katrina when I was a medical student. My apartment was flooded. All of these events, even one of these events, can lead to underlying complex emotions of isolation, grief, fear, shame. And these emotions, this pain, this suffering, this is what leads to people wanting to self-medicate. My own patient, Ryan, and he's one of many, many that I've taken care of who've all experienced these emotions, these experiences. I want to make sure that we're all clear on the definition of addiction, which is a chronic medical disease, a relapsing and remitting disease of the brain that causes compulsive drug seeking and use, despite the harm to the person using and to those around him or her. It is not a sign of moral weakness or failure. In medical school, and I'm sure like in law school, and in undergrad, you're bombarded with all this information. I like using mnemonics. So think of the 4 C's of addiction. It's an impaired control, compulsive use, continued use, and cravings. That is the primary symptom in addiction. If you're having, say, a heart attack, maybe the primary symptom would be chest pain. But in addiction, it's craving, and it's really hard to deal with. Or think of things that you really like when you're really craving that chocolate cake or that glass of wine. It's an intense feeling. Remember, of the 23 million Americans with substance use disorder, only 10% are accessing treatment. We need effective interventions, and this is where I really want to spend time talking to you. So, we need to really reduce the stigma that's associated with addiction. So what's stigma? It's any type of attribute, behavior, condition that's socially discrediting. Remember what I just told you, right? Of the 23 million Americans with substance use disorder, only 10% are accessing treatment. Stigma is the major barrier to seeking help. According to the World Health Organization, drug addiction is the #1 most stigmatized social problem. Social problem, not just a health problem. So more than incarceration, poverty, more than mental illness, more than alcohol. So I'm going to offer to you a really simple but effective way to reduce stigma, and that's by changing our language. So instead of so studies show that when we use stigmatizing, punitive, tough language, like substance abuser, drug abuse, junkie, lush, addict, cokehead, your urine is dirty, Studies show that when we use language like that, patients are less likely to seek help and they're more likely to perceive discrimination. And then healthcare professionals, doctors like me, nurses, they have less regard for patients with addiction. They describe it as being less motivated, manipulative, violent, and they spend less time in clinic with them. All of that adds up to suboptimal care. As opposed to using less stigmatizing language, like substance use disorder, a person with substance use issues. Your urine is positive for opiates. Studies show that when we use language like this, patients feel less judged, more respected, it improves that doctor-patient relationship, and they're more likely to seek care. So that's stigma. I'm going to really briefly talk about naloxone, really just to say that for every patient who gets a prescription for, say, a Vicodin or Percocet, and by the way, there's absolutely a role for opioids in people in which it's clinically indicated. For that, every script for an opioid, they need to also get naloxone or Narcan. And that's at the individual level, at the community level. You guys know AEDs, right? Defibrillators? They are everywhere, right? They're in schools, they're in airports. We need to do the same thing with naloxone. And in fact, in Rhode Island, they have something called the Nalox box, okay? And along with that has to come widespread training in the community. But this is what I really want to talk to you guys about. We need to really decrease the egregious treatment gap by prescribing far more medications that are evidence-based. So we have very good data showing that medications for addiction treatment, like methadone, buprenorphine, and more recently naltrexone, they decrease rates of relapse, they decrease overdose deaths, and they decrease healthcare and criminal justice costs. And yet, only 20% of people with opioid use disorder get this evidence-based treatment. So, how do you actually treat opioid addiction? So think of two areas, two arms. There's the medication arm, and then there's behavioral treatments. Okay, methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, also known the injectable long-acting is also known as Vivitrol. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about these two right here. So pharmacotherapies. By the way, I think you've heard MAT every time you see that in the New York Times or any article online. They refer to it as medication-assisted treatment. So let me correct you there. I'm really, me and my colleagues are trying to change it to medications for addiction treatment. Our psychology colleagues back in the day when addiction was in the realm of psychiatry and psychology called it assisted because it was assisting the counseling and the therapy. Now we know it's straight up an addiction treatment, just like insulin. It's not assisting diabetes, it's treating diabetes. Okay, methadone, what is it? It's a medication that's similar to morphine. It's binding the same opioid receptor as a morphine Percocet. It's used in maintenance programs to treat people addicted to heroin or other opiates. It's also used to treat chronic pain. So how does it work? So it's a full agonist. In other words, it's binding the receptor, the opioid receptor, fully. But the difference is, you might think, well, Lipi, then how is it not a heroin, right? Heroin acts like this and comes crashing back down. Its action of onset is within 1 to 2 minutes. Methadone, on the other hand, takes hours and then finally days to build up, and it stays in your system. That's why it's effective as a medication for opioid addiction. It successfully reduces withdrawal symptoms and cravings, and it allows patients to engage in recovery. Make no mistake, methadone is a life-saving medication. You're also going to hear things like, oh, he's been detoxed, he's good. Oh, she went at jail, she was detoxed, she's fine. No. So what's detoxification? It means that a patient is weaned off their dependence on opioids slowly by methadone. You can also use buprenorphine. But relapse rates from detox alone are over 90%. That means these people who are just detoxed are going to go on to relapse, use, and very likely die. It is not treatment. As opposed to maintenance. People are on either methadone, buprenorphine for extended periods of time. Prevents withdrawal, it decreases cravings. It is a path to recovery. Public health impact. Again, let me emphasize, I did not learn any of this in medical school or residency. This has been on-the-job training and learning. Look at all of the public health benefits of maintenance. Reduces hepatitis B and C transmission, reduces HIV, increases employment, reduces criminal activity, illicit opiate use, increases length of life, and here's the real key. It reduces opioid overdose deaths by up to 80%. just this one medication alone. This doesn't even include co-parent counseling. So some myths. If you haven't heard, I'm sure you will. Methadone is just substituting one addiction for another. I hear this all the time, and I always correct people. Methadone is a medication used to treat people with opioid use disorder. It reduces cravings and withdrawal, restores balance to the brain. It allows a person to return to recovery. Another myth, oh, methadone is gonna get you high. So when a person first starts treatment, they may feel lightheaded and sleepy, but when the body builds tolerance, they'll soon begin to feel normal. A little bit about Suboxone, or buprenorphine actually. So what is it? It's a medication that binds the same receptor as methadone and morphine, and it's used to treat opioid addiction. It can also relieve pain. But unlike methadone, it's a full agonist. It's a partial agonist. But think of it as a magnet. It binds so strongly to that opioid receptor, it'll bump off whatever else was on there, okay? But because it's an agonist and a partial one, it will still have activity at that site, which is why it's successful at reducing cravings and withdrawal symptoms. And it allows patients to engage in recovery and very low risk of overdose. Make no mistake, buprenorphine, like methadone, is a life-saving medication. I'll speak a little briefly about psychosocial therapies. Really, counseling, group, individual, helps people engage in treatment, helps them handle stressful circumstances. There's many different types like CBT, motivational interviewing. Okay, so what ended up happening to my patient Brian? So the first thing I said to him was that I'm glad that he came to see me, that he took time to come to clinic and share his story. I said that we were going to work together to get him the help that he needs and deserves. I connected him to care, psychiatry, orthopedic surgery, case management. I also started on buprenorphine for his opioid use disorder, and in time he began to feel better. Better physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. Today, Brian has an apartment, he has a relationship with his son, he is in recovery. In all, Brian's life has a sense of purpose. And what's really exciting is that his story will be featured is being featured right now in a documentary short film. It's only 20 minutes and it's produced by Refinery 29. And I'm privileged to be able to share his story. That's a picture from the film. These are several references. By the way, there's a lot of excellent films and books. If you haven't read Johann Hari's Chasing the Scream, I highly recommend it. I learned a lot from reading that book. 13 by Ava DuVernay puts mass incarceration in the context of slavery. And yeah, that's what I have. You can feel free to email me, tweet me. So thank you very much for your time.
So I guess we'll go down now. Sally Friedman will speak, and then Mark Kleiman, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Okay, I do not have a presentation.
That is
But I should stand up
okay.
anyway.
Whatever you want to do.
Well, I think everyone can see me better if I stand up, so I will do that. So thank you. That was, every time I hear Dr. Roy speak, I'm inspired and I learn new things. And that was the perfect setup for what I'm going to say. Because, so I've been a lawyer for about almost 25 years at the Legal Action Center, which is a nonprofit just down the street on Houston and Barrett. And the Legal Action Center is a law and policy organization that works to eliminate discrimination against people with substance disorders, HIV or AIDS, and criminal justice histories, and to protect their privacy rights. And our approach and belief is that substance use disorders should be treated as a public health issue and not a criminal justice or punitive issue. And recognizing that, as Dr. Lipi explained, a substance use disorder is a treatable chronic disease and not a moral failing. We believe that it should be treated like other diseases, and that if it were treated like other diseases, that would be much more effective than simply trying to incarcerate our way out of a problem. And so for decades, the Legal Action Center has worked to expand treatment for all, and also to bring a more public health approach to the criminal justice system. And what we find is that the type of pervasive stigma and discrimination that Dr. Roy talked about is a huge barrier to care. And even in healthcare, where you think people should feel safe to go and get help, People often feel afraid to even mention to their doctors that they have an addiction for fear that they will be treated with a kind of disdain and dismissal that Dr. Roy describes. And in the workplace, people who, who say that someone tells their employer that they want a leave of absence to go into treatment for a substance disorder, as opposed to, let's say, treatment for cancer or another medical condition, there's a good chance they may be fired. And they will not have legal protection for that because the Americans with Disabilities Act and our state and city human rights laws, while they protect from discrimination people with alcoholism, current and in their past, when it comes to addiction to drugs, you're only protected from discrimination if you are in recovery from your addiction and have been for quite a while. If you're currently suffering from addiction and so you need to go into treatment, you can be summarily terminated and you have no legal recourse. So people really have an incentive to try and hide it rather than get the help that they need. There's also discrimination when it comes to locating new treatment programs. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the kind of not in my backyard attitudes that people often don't want all kinds of social service help and facilities in their neighborhood, but they have particular disdain for programs that treat substance use disorders. And so now, even with the opioid epidemic, even when there is funding to open new methadone programs and treatment programs, they often can't open because there's such opposition in the neighborhood. Many people saying, of course they support treatment, they just not here. So, and in fact, so Legal Action Center brought a case years ago against the city of White Plains just for denying zoning permission for an outpatient treatment program, and because people in the neighborhood, were worried, and they would have a meeting about all the drug addicts and criminals that are going to come into our neighborhood, and we successfully sued that violated the Americans with Disabilities Act, and got an opinion from our highest federal Court of Appeals in New York. But that's that was a huge barrier to the locating program. And people with substance use disorders are also targeted for discrimination in government benefits. So years ago, during the Clinton administration, Congress passed laws that imposed a lifetime ban on people from getting access to food stamps if they had a drug felony conviction. Not other kinds of felony convictions, but a drug felony conviction in particular. If any of you applied for student financial aid, you probably remember the question on the application about whether you had any convictions for a drug felony. So, and if you did, you would be ineligible for student financial assistance for unless you could show that you had been in treatment. The law was amended to allow you to show that you had been in treatment. And it was amended because of advocacy of groups like ours. And then, of course, there's the war on drugs, which has really brought a mass incarceration approach to the problem of addiction. And so, so with all this backdrop, this is all playing out in the current opioid epidemic. But there's the additional problem of the stigma that's associated with the most common medication to treat opioid use disorder are the types of medications that Dr. Roy described: methadone, buprenorphine, and Vivitrol. They're proven, and methadone, which has been around since the 60s, has been the subject of more studies probably than any other medication in the history of medicine, and shown to be effective. And yet, throughout the criminal justice system and the child welfare system, people are routinely denied access to these medications. And so this is what I'm just going to focus on for the rest, because this is an issue I've been working on a lot in the last few years, is to expand access to effective medication to treat opioid addiction at every stage of the criminal justice system. From the moment of contact with a police officer, the response shouldn't have been let's arrest and then have the DA charge the highest charge they can muster, but let's see if there's an alternative such as treatment. And so there are drug treatment courts, there are other types of alternatives to incarceration, and there's also the need for treatment while incarcerated. But unfortunately, most of the nation's prisons and jails do not allow any type of medication to treat opioid use disorder. The first exception was Rikers Island, and it continues to be one of the few jails in the country that does allow access to these medications. And because most don't, some people have died from withdrawal-related complications when they are jailed. And also, there's no effort to link people to treatment when they get out, for the most part. And while you're incarcerated, most people stop using, although there is an illicit drug trade in jails and prisons, but most people pretty much stop using, so your tolerance goes down. And then when you get out, if you resume your use at the level it was before, there's a good chance you will die from a drug overdose. And so the rate of people, of death, of overdose after leaving prison is sky high. And in Rhode Island recently is one of the few states that has started allowing medications to treat addiction in the prison system, and early studies are already showing dramatic decreases in overdose deaths of people leaving prison. Another huge problem is courts that force people to get off their addiction medication, so get off their methadone, get off their buprenorphine, as a condition of probation or as a condition of graduating from a drug court. So here drug courts are set up in theory to help people, to guide people into drug treatment instead of incarcerating them. But many drug courts across the country will say, well, that treatment cannot include medication. Even though medication is scientifically proven to be the most effective way to treat opioid addiction. So we have heard from clients all over the country who are in a court, whether it's a drug court or in some other court, and they are told that they must get off their methadone or buprenorphine. And they're given an arbitrary number of days by the judge, who is not a doctor, 30 days, 90 days, and completely contrary to the patient's own doctor's recommendations. They're given an arbitrary timeline, and they're told that they'll be incarcerated if they're not off. And so many of our clients try to taper off the medication, because you can't just stop cold turkey, because these are opioids, and you will go through withdrawal if you just stop cold turkey. So they try working with their doctors, against their doctor's better judgment, to slowly taper down their drug use, but they usually reach a point which they start having terrible cravings, start feeling very uncomfortable, they're exhausted, they can't sleep, they're incredibly anxious because they know that their chance of relapse increases significantly if they go off the medication that's actually been working to keep them from using illicit drugs. But they have this kind of hammer of prison hanging over their heads if they don't get off. And so this is the kind of thing that we have been bringing legal challenges to, and we believe that this violates the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Constitution. And so we have been educating courts about this and advocating for the right to effective evidence-based treatment in the criminal justice system. And we also worked with the Office of Court Administration in New York to create a guide for courts about how to effectively use medications. And we went around and we spoke to courts because we heard from some drug courts, I can't allow those drugs in my courtroom. People will be, how am I going to monitor that? And people will be selling their medications on the street, and this kind of whole parade of horribles I kept hearing. And so then we went and we spoke to a number of courts around New York, in all regions, way upstate, way off to the west, here in New York City, who are allowing these medications, and we asked them for their experience, and we found out that it actually works, and that people actually do get better, and they do graduate from drug court, and that one court told us that when they were making people get off their medication prior to graduation, kept relapsing, and then they would have to extend their drug court for another 6 months. And they found, so let's let them be on methadone. And then they realized people actually graduated. So through education, through legal advocacy, we are trying to get more access to effective evidence-based treatment in the justice system, and that's one way to tackle this kind of horrible epidemic. Thank you.
Those are two tough acts to follow. As you will have judged from the introduction, I'm really old. When I got into this, we were still at the end of the last heroin epidemic. So I'm a policy analyst by trade. So the question I ask is generally not what's happening, but what should we do about it. It's a different way to look at the world. But I want to start with a little bit of description. So as was pointed out, Purdue Pharma introduces Oxycontin, a very high-dose version of oxycodone, in around 1996, 97. And many of us thought that was the beginning of the resurgent opioid epidemic. That turns out not to be true. In fact, if you look at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which asks people about use of a bunch of different drugs, legal and illegal, and also the question, is this the first year you use that drug? So that initiation number, which number we ought to be looking at, instead of the total number of users, initiation number starts at around, troughs at around 200,000 a year in around 1992. I don't know what it was about 1992, but that was the year that drug use started going down and started going back up. True for cannabis, true for non-medical use of the opiates. Between 1992 and 2001, that initiation number went from 200,000 a year to 2.4 million a year. So non-medical use of opiates actually passed cannabis in drug initiations. Now remember, Oxycontin comes in the middle of that run. So it looks to me as if Oxycontin was riding the back of a wave that was already there. Now, it doesn't change the fact that Purdue Pharma did a lot of very aggressive stuff. And they hired the snake's friend, Rudy Giuliani, to keep them out of prison, which he did. The company was criminally convicted, but none of the people who worked for it was criminally convicted, which is a good trick if you know how to do it. It's also true, and this is easy to forget if you're not as old as I am, that there was a history of the undertreatment, particularly of chronic pain. Disgraceful history. People died in agony of cancer because their doctors were afraid of addicting them. And that was just dim-witted. And that's still the medical practice in most of the world. And I don't think it's a bad thing that in the US we decided that pain hurts and we should stop people from having it if we can. And I'm a little bit afraid, quite afraid, that we're now pushing the pendulum back in the other direction. And we now have people who are either going onto the illicit market or killing themselves because their doctors say, I can't keep prescribing opiates because I'm told that's a bad thing to do. So that's something to worry about. Anyway, so we had this surge in the non-medical use of opiates. So it turned out that Oxycontin, which was designed as an extended release drug and therefore marketed as less addictive than the shorter acting versions of the same molecule. Well, except if you read the patient package insert, it said in big letters, do not get this thing wet or break it up, or you will defeat the time release feature. Well, yes, people figured that out pretty quickly. 5 milligrams of Oxycontin is a standard dose for modest acute pain. It's what your dentist will give you after a wisdom tooth extraction. Oxycontin came in 10, 20, 40, 80, and 160 milligram doses. And there was a lot of pressure on Purdue Pharma to back off. And after dragging their heels as long as they could, in 2011, they reformulated Oxycontin. Basically put some gel into the pill so that you could not break it up, dissolve it, and inject it or store it. And magically, Oxycontin deaths started dropping. Right, so it's quite clear that whatever the roots of the addiction tree are, supply matters a lot. And what happened with Oxycontin was that opiates, which had been an urban, largely minority problem, unavailable in most of the country. And look, that's a stable situation. If there are no heroin users in town, there's no point trying to be a heroin dealer in that town. And if there's no heroin dealer in your town, then there's no way to become a heroin user. So that's a completely stable situation. And the other situation where there are lots of dealers and lots of users is also stable. What Purdue managed to do was break the stability by making every corner pharmacy a source of high-dose narcotics. And suddenly you had an opiate epidemic in Appalachia. Right? When Oxycontin was first recognized as a problem, its nickname was hillbilly heroin. Speaking of stigma, think about a social group for which there is no non-stigmatized name. Right? How would you describe the upland residents of Appalachia in a word that's not an insult? Not entirely surprising that a group that's that stigmatized winds up with a bad substance abuse problem if somebody gives them a lot of a very attractive substance. So, the pattern that was developing, even before the reformulation of Oxycontin, was that people would get drugs, or get the narcotics, either prescribed to them. There was I think still a small minority. The legitimate part of the opiate addiction story is that a relatively small number of people who take opiates as prescribed by their physician will wind up with an addictive disorder. The people who get in trouble are the people who go out and seek opioids, frequently from multiple physicians, or people who get the drugs illicitly from the people to whom they were prescribed, either accidentally, kids raiding their parents' medicine cabinet, informally on a schoolyard where the oxycodone is traded for the ADHD medicine, or on full illicit markets. And then there were a group of people who made a living getting prescriptions and reselling them. And there were a limited number of physicians and pharmacists who were actively, corruptly complicit in this, running things that were called pill mills. Well, it was two things were obvious as early as 2001. One was that there was a pattern of conversion from non-medical use of the opioids to use of street heroin. And the pattern was that people started swallowing the pills. It seemed pretty harmless and safe. It was in a pill, it was in a bottle. Somebody had gotten it from a doctor. It wasn't contaminated. You weren't buying it from a bad guy. A lot of people never would have touched heroin. We're willing to try their friend's oxycodone. The good news is only about 25% of the population enjoys opioids. 75% of the people either get pain relief and feel no psychological effect at all, or feel a psychological effect that they hate. I'm part of the fortunate minority, or potentially unfortunate minority, that actually gets a buzz. So that's going to put a limit on how bad this can be, as opposed to cocaine, right? Anything with fur likes cocaine. So people would start to use the pills, run up their dose, and one of two things would happen. Either they'd run up the dose to the point where they couldn't either scam it or buy it, right? They'd gone past their supply capacity, or they'd gotten to the point where oral medication was not satisfying them, and they wanted to start injecting. Either of those was likely to lead people to the heroin market. For other reasons, heroin, which had been a very expensive drug when I got into this business, it's about $2.40 a pure milligram in 1979. That's $12 in today's money for a milligram of pure heroin on the street. That is, say you buy a $10 bag and it'd have 3 milligrams of heroin. That street price is now about 15 cents a pure milligram. And the result was that people who got strung out on the prescription opioids could convert to street heroin, getting it in a form that they could inject, which is a much more potent and economical way to use the drug, and also was much cheaper. Because oxycodone on the illicit market was trading at $1 a milligram, and they're about roughly equivalent in terms of pain relief. So people would trade down from the prescription opiates to heroin, or they would be a customer of a pill mill and the pill mill would get raided. I was talking to law enforcement folks in southern Illinois, southern Ohio, just across the river from Kentucky, which had a bad Oxycontin problem. And they were very proud of themselves. They had raided the local pill mill and shut it down. And they were shocked to report that heroin dealers had come in from Cleveland and Louisville. Well, yeah, you've got a population of opiate-addicted people. You've taken away their opiate supplier. Somebody's going to fill that niche. And one of the real failings of law enforcement back then was to not treat the patient list of the pill mill as a target list for treatment. They were potential defendants or potential witnesses. Nobody had noticed that they were also potential customers for heroin unless you got them into treatment. That was not regarded as part of the law enforcement function. So it was a terrible situation. If you let the pill mills keep running, they would generate new people who eventually, many of them, would think about moving to heroin. If you shut the pill mill down, you would move them all to heroin right away. So it was a pay me now or pay me later problem. I think the reformulation was probably a good idea. But what you see around the time of reformulation is that Oxycontin deaths level off and start to drop. Heroin deaths zoom right up. And then coming in behind heroin are the fentanyls. And it's a little confusing. You will see references in the newspaper to something called fentanyl, which is supposed to be 50 times the potency of morphine. No, there ain't no such animals. There's a drug called fentanyl, which is a perfectly legitimate medical drug. You might have had it for surgery. Got about, what, 10 MME, something like that? Something like that. It's sort of 10 times the potency of morphine. Frequently used as patches for people with chronic, usually terminal pain. And it turns out you can dissolve the patch in alcohol and extract the fentanyl. So it's a very potent drug, and there's some amount of diversion of that. There's a little bit of illicit manufacturing in this country, not very much. There was actually some that around the 80s. I thought fentanyl was going to take the market, and it never. People wouldn't use it because it's too much of an overdose risk. When you're trying to give somebody 1 milligram instead of 10 milligrams, the risk of getting it under illicit conditions is pretty high. And somehow somebody solved that quality assurance problem. Unfortunately, fentanyl is only one of a class of, I think there are 400 identified fentanyl class drugs that are variations on the same molecular structure. Some of them more potent than apparent fentanyl itself. Some of them enormously more potent. So the one that I know, most potent I know, is carfentanil, which is something like 5,000 morphine milligram equivalents. So the active dose of carfentanil is a microgram. And you can imagine that if you try to package a microgram illicitly, the probability of getting 8 micrograms, which will kill somebody, is pretty high. And so fentanyl is far more deadly. The fentanyls as a class, far more deadly than either the diverted opiates or heroin itself, partly because they're more potent, and partly because nobody knows what he's getting. In addition, there are some people who are pressing things that look like Oxycontin pills out of fentanyl. It's a very cheap drug. It's manufactured in China illicitly, and it comes into New York by a very, very dangerous adjunct to the drug dealing business called the United States Postal Service. People literally mail grams of fentanyl from China to New York and other target cities. Very hard for me to see what on the enforcement end we can do about that. Right? Because you've now eliminated the poppy farmer. You can't spray the fentanyl crop because there's no crop. And you've eliminated all the middlemen between the importer and the street. So essentially retail dealers are buying direct from China. very hard to see what you're going to do on the supply side of that. That's going to matter. So what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we'd like people not to die. And we've done remarkably well at that. Everybody focuses on the 53,000 or whatever the number is of overdose deaths. What's less well known is the number of rescues is about twice that. So of the people who take a fatal dose of an opioid, about 2/3 are Narcan out of it, which is an astonishing accomplishment. And there's more to be done on that front. But of course, that's only half the battle, right? Now you've got somebody who has been saved. You might think that a near-fatal overdose would send somebody running to treatment. In fact, typically somebody who's been revived curses out the guy who survived because he's wasted all that money he spent on the drugs and walks away. And I'm sure there's a technique that could be developed to get people who've just been revived into treatment, but we haven't found it yet. Putting people in prison for using drugs is a silly activity. We shouldn't do it. It's easy to overestimate how much of it we actually do. Most of the people who are in prison around the drug issue either were dealing, which is a fairly common thing for people with addictions to do. It's an easy way to support yourself. Or doing some other economic crime and wind up getting arrested and convicted for that. Not many people in a drug court were arrested for drug possession. So the notion that there's some straightforward public health approach to this problem doesn't seem to me to fit the facts very well, unless you want to actually legalize drug dealing. Don't. I mean, one of the things we should have learned from the current epidemic is that easing up on opioid supply, in this case through the pharmaceutical system, generates a lot of addiction. It's clear that some of the people who had all of those roots of addiction before weren't getting addicted to opioids because they didn't have opioids available. And that was a better place to be than the place we are now. One more thing and I'll give up. It's true that over the last 2 years, mortality rates in the U.S. have gone up as life expectancy has gone down. It's a striking fact that everybody's hair isn't on fire about that. Life expectancies do not go down in advanced societies, absent war or pestilence. The only somewhat economically advanced society I know of that had a sustained decrease in life expectancy was Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. What you saw was late middle-aged to early elderly men whose pensions had been wiped out, drinking themselves to death. So I wouldn't over-attribute the changes in total U.S. society to the opiate problem. Yes, it's certainly true that opiate use is a cause of death. It's also true that lots of causes of stress-related causes of death have been going up since 1999. This is not a new phenomenon. And that partly what we're seeing is that people who have basically decided to die figure out that opioids are a good way to do it. So we've got an opioid problem that we need to worry about. A much deeper problem, particularly in the economically bombed out parts of the country, basically Trump country, of people not seeing any purpose or any hope. And to some extent the opioid problem is riding on the back of that, and that's going to be a bigger problem to solve. I should add, though, what gets recorded by the medical examiners in opioid deaths, at least it was true 5 years ago, it's less true today. But about 5 years ago, about 75% of those people weren't just using opioids, right? And it was generally combinations with alcohol or the benzodiazepines. Valium and its Xanax and their relatives, which potentiate the respiratory depression of the opioids. Much more dangerous, right? I mean, it's sort of hard to kill yourself just with heroin, but a little alcohol or a little Valium will help. Now, with the fentanyls, the more potent fentanyls coming in, they're enough on their own to do the job. But just controlling the opioid problem doesn't get us there. There's a lot of very irresponsible benzo prescribing that might be actually easier to crack down on, and that's something we'll take a serious look at. All right, I hope I've left you sufficiently confused and depressed. Thank you.
Thank you. So, most of my questions were answered, but the White House announced that it's a national, I don't even know, a national public health crisis, is that right? Public health emergency, not
Yes.
fully a crisis. What does that mean? And
No, there's no legal term of crisis. They announced an emergency, and then didn't do any of the things, did not take advantage of any of the powers that an emergency proclamation actually provides.
what are those powers?
Well, they could have, there were some HHS regs about treatment, for example, that probably could have been relaxed once you declared an emergency. And one of the things I didn't talk about is the regulation of particularly methadone availability is based on the Narcotic Addiction Treatment Act of 1974, something like that. Right? So the Narcotic Addiction Treatment Act was passed the year we discovered the opioid receptor. I think it's time for an update. Any physician or any other health professional allowed to prescribe under state law, so physician's assistants, nurse practitioners, dentists, veterinarians, in some states naturopaths, can write prescriptions for as much opioid as they want. No limit, whatever. No special training. There's now reporting requirements under the narcotic, what's it called? Prescription, PNPs, prescription monitoring programs. But there's no limit on the actual behavior of the medical profession. If you're dealing with somebody with an addiction, and you want to give them either buprenorphine or methadone to treat the addiction, right? The other thing is you can write as much methadone as you want for pain, but specifically methadone for the maintenance of addiction can only be given out in a specialized clinic with its own license. And it can only be dispensed, it can't be prescribed. Which means that a methadone user has to come in every day. We once referred to it as being on chemical probation. And then there's this complicated thing about, oh, if you're a good boy, we'll give you take-home doses. Even, and buprenorphine,
Requires a waiver.
every physician has to do special training. Now, I'm not against that in principle. I think anybody who wants to prescribe any class of drugs ought to have to demonstrate that he knows what he's doing, including antibiotics. But that's not our actual rule. It's only buprenorphine where you have to jump through this additional loop.
It's one of many barriers, but it's a really key one, right? I think I emphasized more than once that buprenorphine and methadone are life-saving treatments, and yet, so is metformin, by the way, and insulin for my diabetic patients, chemotherapy for my lung cancer patients. Not a single oncologist or endocrinologist or primary care doctor has to go through these loops, jump through these loops that Professor Kleiman is pointing out. I mean, as I have a waiver to prescribe buprenorphine. The only reason I can prescribe methadone is because I work in an addiction treatment center that has a regulation by OASAS, our state agency. But the things that we make people with addiction go through just to get treatment. Can you imagine somebody, and Sally pointed this out a bit too, on a methadone maintenance programs treatments, for somebody to actually stand outside a methadone treatment program, to be labeled the way that they are, one of those words that I put up there, right? Druggie, and because they see them as being kind of lethargic, and Professor Kleiman talked about benzos. Most of the people that are on methadone that's properly prescribed, it's not the methadone that's causing them to be high or lethargic, it's usually all the other substances. By the way, many of them are on psychiatric meds, which are very sedating. Many of them are on benzos. all of them are very sedating. And you can my former mentor in Boston told me, you can always see somebody on the streets in Boston who's on a benzo. Because they're walking in a certain way, they're staggering, and it's not the opiates that do it, the benzo specifically.
So what's the best way to approach somebody who has an opioid problem and a benzo problem at the same time? I heard a lot about the MAP approach with opioids. What about benzos?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, it's tricky. So at my addiction treatment center, we see lots of people, mostly still coming in. I didn't even talk about, we're talking about opioids a lot now because it's getting national attention. And the one good thing about that is that's highlighting the attention really on the bigger issue, which is addiction, right? You know, and again, Professor Kleiman pointed out that opioid, Oxycontin 92, I put it at 95, but really the trend was going up before that. Addiction is nothing new. People have been using alcohol, and far more people die of tobacco and alcohol than they do of opiates. Just to be really clear about that.
But the alcohol one's easy, right? I mean, we could reduce alcohol-related deaths by 5% by tripling the federal alcohol tax. Wouldn't have to crash through anybody's door, wouldn't have to put anybody in prison. It's just sitting there, and we don't do it. That's a crime.
But how do we attack the benzo?
So when patients come into our addiction treatment center, they come and say benzo use and opiates at the same time. So unlike opioid addiction or withdrawal, alcohol and benzo withdrawal can be fatal. They need to be detoxed. Opiates, on the other hand, you can be maintained with medications. So you just have to dose it very carefully. Librium for the taper for the benzos, and then a medication like a buprenorphine.
Because I supervise a Bronx criminal court, and we're trying to engage in people very early on in arraignments and get them. And it's not uncommon that I'm dealing with people who have this cocktail of problems. So I think what I'm hearing is we have to be multifaceted.
So
You
it's
know,
doable,
one on the opioid end,
Yeah.
more or less of a maybe being open-minded to a MAP approach. But if you've got the co-terminology of like the benzo issue, then you might want to get a detox
Not
aspect.
right. They need to be detoxed.
They need to be detoxed.
Yeah. Assuming that patient's willing to and ready to get treatment.
What type of detox are you talking about? What type of length to do that?
It's 5 days.
5-6 days?
But the other thing is, so once you've got the guy stabilized on methadone or buprenorphine and off the benzos, that may or may not be a stable condition. So something like 50% of methadone patients are either supplementing with other opioids or using some other illegal drug. Cocaine's the one where the deaths are really soaring right now. My belief is, and this is a minority belief, is the best approach where it's available is frequent random drug testing with mild sanctions on probation, right? So in Hawaii, we reduced methamphetamine use 80% in a heavily resistant population with nothing but occasional drug tests. And after the first 3 months, most of them didn't have any problems. But that's an approach that's very contentious within the treatment community.
So cocaine rates are actually rising, but a major reason is because these drug dealers are really smart, creative people. They know what works, what's going to get people hooked. So actually, over 50% of overdose deaths now are associated with fentanyl. So they're putting fentanyl into
that's what we're
cocaine,
fentanyl in
into everything.
Yeah, right.
So fentanyl is actually 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Carfentanil is up to 10,000 times more. You know what carfentanil is used for? It's a horse it's an elephant tranquilizer. So even inhaling a small amount can actually be fatal. It's dangerous stuff. So, but the underlying cause will just never really happen. Even though I'm very pro medications, I also believe that we cannot medicate our way out of this. Even though I'm a doctor, I believe that medicines work. I don't believe in just throwing medicines at people. Dr. Goldberg is a cardiologist. I believe that the primary way to treat hypertension is actually not to give a medication. It's not what I believe. Data shows that it's actually lifestyle, right? let's eat healthier, let's exercise, your blood pressure will get better. And if that doesn't work over, say, 6 months, then we'll start medications.
Nash diet,
There you go.
which was popularized by NYU.
There you go.
If I could, on a more macro level, is this a distinctly American problem?
Yes and no. I mean, I think you guys probably already know the data, and I think my colleagues might have also said that we use, 85% of the world's opiate supply, and yet we make up only 5% of the world population. We use a lot of it. There's many reasons for that. However, this is actually a global issue. Many countries are experiencing this, and they deal with it very differently. So there's one extreme of the Portugals and the Hollands, which actually have decriminalized drug use, and there's something to be said about that. There's plenty of data to support decriminalization, and in the countries that do that, even just having a safe injection facility that Vancouver does, the data is very clear. Overdose death goes down, drug use goes down, drug-related crimes go down. And I didn't think, I'm 99% optimistic most of the time, but in this area I used to be pessimistic. I thought, there's no way the US will ever have a safe consumption site. It's actually probably going to happen. Philadelphia, San Francisco, Boston, and New York. Mayor de Blasio is getting tremendous pressure, just so. And then the other extreme are the Philippines, right? So Duterte is just mass murdering people. So we're not there, but we are, as Sally pointed out, we are incarcerating people. We have judges. We went to the same conference last year on drug treatment courts, and there were judges that came to me and said, Rory, I only make sentence recommendations based on what a clinician tells me. I have other judge colleagues who will say, oh, that was like too high a dose of methadone. I don't think it should be on such a high dose. And they'll forcibly cut them down, taper, or just cut them off completely. So they're playing the role of judge and doctor. So if I were to focus on two groups of people, it would be judges and it would be doctors. And then of course there are policy, government, schools, everything.
I guess a legal representation standpoint, what would you have to say about how this is affecting families?
Well, I mean, it's certainly tearing many families apart, and addiction tears families apart, right? Addiction to any substance can tear a family apart, and the problem is we have this whole kind of child welfare system kind of built up around the idea of safety for children. So parents are charged with abuse or neglect when their substance use is negatively affecting their children in such a way to endanger them, and so there's a large increase in the number of children in foster care, and the same problem that I talked about in the criminal justice system goes on in the family courts. So we've had clients, I'll give you an example of a woman who lives up in Sullivan County, which is a couple hours upstate, and she had an opioid addiction for years, beginning with, she was in a car crash, she was prescribed pain medication, and actually, my experience with a lot of clients is they did become addicted initially from pain medications that were prescribed from a back injury or a car crash, and then she started taking more than was prescribed and turned to heroin, and for a number of years gave custody of her only daughter to her mother. And then she went into methadone treatment, and after a year and a half, where she had no positive drug test for methadone, for illicit drugs, for a year and a half. So she, with her mother's consent, she walked herself into the Sullivan County Family Court one day with a petition to regain custody of her 9-year-old daughter, and the judge, when he heard she was on methadone, he said, you go into your methadone program today and you tell them you're done. And I don't give custody to parents who are on methadone. You've got to be off for 6 months before I would consider giving you custody. And she, walked out of that courtroom shaking and then contacted us. So I think it's a huge problem for families, and unfortunately, the response within the child welfare system is not where it needs to be.
Yeah. So at this point, we'll take a few questions from.
Yeah, so I had a question, which is that, it seems, my understanding is that part of the problem largely comes down to the debate over whether to treat this as a criminal or a public health matter. And so far, it seems like, if there's going to be a successful intervention, it has to occur at the prosecutorial stage, because ultimately that's first contact for a lot of people. And, a lot of prosecutors and district attorneys still measure success by the number of people they're able to successfully incarcerate. There's very little understanding in terms of, there are some experiments now with the drug parts and whatever in courts, but it's still a very slow moving process. How do you recommend, from a policy perspective, medical and legal, kind of, engaging local prosecutors, district attorneys, judges, folks that are kind of causing people to be criminalized for their addiction, to sort of gain a larger understanding and possibly come to a point of prescribing treatment rather than, severe punishment.
Again, let's not overstate how much people are criminalized for their addiction as opposed to the crimes they commit to get money. I mean, I don't know what it means to treat somebody who's a heroin dealer for his heroin habit as a public health problem. Right? He's a public health problem because he's supplying heroin to people.
And he's robbing the bank to get money to feed his addiction.
So, my response to that is that it's not just drug possession that would make someone eligible for an alternative to incarceration. So if the addiction is what's driving their criminal conduct, whether the criminal conduct is simple use, whether it's selling, whether it's shoplifting, as many of our clients do, I'm sure in your court there's people with, whether it's misdemeanor or felony, there's all kinds of crimes that people commit as a result of their addiction. And you can throw them in jail, and they're likely to recidivate when they get out and be just as addicted as when they went in. Or you can try to address the underlying problem. And so that's what we're advocating for, is addressing a whole number of crimes that are caused by addiction with a public health response. And to answer your question of how you convince the prosecutors, who are one key element, but certainly not the only element, I think there are some, some elements, some areas where prosecutors are kind of coming on board with that. But it requires just a lot of political pressure, advocacy, and collaborations. I mean, I did go to a conference last year by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that organized a conference on this exact topic, and where all various people in the criminal justice system in New York were getting together to acknowledge that incarceration isn't going to solve this problem. And there are some pilot programs where prosecutors are agreeing not to prosecute people for low-level offenses at all. So it's not just the way normally that a kind of alternative to incarceration programs work is people go into court, they often have to take a guilty plea, and then they're given the chance to go into treatment. And if they successfully complete their treatment, then the plea to their felony gets reduced, or in some instances maybe even dismissed. But there's another approach, which is instead of prosecuting the person and having them take a guilty plea, don't prosecute them at all, direct them straight into treatment. And they are doing that in certain places in the country.
A lot of this is truly driven by stigma and lack of education information. The history of the drug wars really is racially charged and racially based. I would highly recommend everyone read Johan Hari's book Chasing the Scream. It just puts things into context.
I have to dissent on that point. I read that book. Johan Hari actually called me after it was published. And I discovered that he hadn't read anything or talked to anybody except 6 guys in the drug legalization movement who fed him a lot of stuff.
Even if you don't read that book, there's plenty of other
There's plenty of good books.
Racially charged. I even talk about race in this talk, but there's plenty of evidence that Black Americans make up 13% of America, 14% of drug users, but they make up 56% of people incarcerated for drug-related crimes. So you had your hand up for a long time.
It's kind of two-parted. The first part is that I was thinking before you mentioned Johan Hari. He recently came out with a new book called Lost Connections. I've heard about it through a podcast recently, so it seems like he's going to a lot more people.
Look, we're talking about a guy who lost his job as a journalist for making up facts. I don't know why we're reading anything he's written.
He's talking about depression in this book.
Yeah. The second was more based towards how medical schools in particular treat or teach the management of pain itself as just a medication problem. For example, I know low back pain is a major driver of medications. Large part, I think, from what I've read, because there's the way that back pain is treated is with an understanding of what causes it, and so you have diagnoses of like just degenerative disc disease or this or that, and it's not understanding. So what we need to have a better understanding of what causes it and we're going to treat it better, and how should the medical schools in general shift towards this new public.
So let me, thank you so much for asking that. Usually when I give the 45-minute talks, I do talk about the pain management side of it. So, yeah, so, again, Professor Kleiman talked about pain and that pendulum, in fact, is swinging a little too far the other way, where we're now saying all opiates are bad, everyone who's on opiates should be cut off. And unfortunately, that is what's happening. We're seeing actually higher rates of increased rates of suicide or suicide attempts because people who've been faithfully taking their opiates as prescribed are now suddenly getting cut off. So I have colleagues that are really working on this. But I'm glad you talked about this because you bring up the pain issue. Truth be told, that there is no pain epidemic. There is no pain epidemic. While there are patients who are undertreated, there's been no rise in pain levels, okay? A. Point B is opiates are not even close to first, second, or third line when it comes to pain management. There are certain clinical indications. So if I have appendicitis, I go to the ED, they're going to give me IV opiates, as indicated, right? So there are certain cases where opiates are clearly indicated. But first of all, most pain actually doesn't even need follow-up with therapy. A lot of pain, if you go back to what I was talking about, there's all of these comorbid conditions. A lot of things in life can make pain worse. The way to treat is not necessarily medications. Sometimes it is, but there's like a whole bunch of other things. Ice, heat, massage, acupuncture, all these things. And then for medications, did you know that if you just maximize Tylenol and ibuprofen, that treats a lot of pain? And then, so you start that way, and then there's topical ointments, creams. So there's a whole algorithm. We're trying to do a better job at educating medical students and residents on pain. And this is not just a primary care issue, by the way. This is all fields of.
Yeah.
Pardon me, I have a sore throat, but I'm glad you touched on that. I was thinking about asking about that pretty much the entire time. Just wanted to preface my question by saying I come from one of the most opioid and heroin-ridden sections of New Jersey, which is one of the top 5 or 6, I think, opioid and heroin-ridden states, consistently, pretty much for years.
You have to compete with the happy birthday.
Yeah. This is like a really depressing
Where is that?
question. This is in central New Jersey, specifically Hunterdon County, just across the river from Philadelphia, roughly. Lost my train of thought.
I asked you to go over and stop.
Yeah, should we do some singing or what's going on here?
I went.
So, because it's so rampant where I am, I guess what the point I was going at was I have a rap sheet of case study options from people that I've known. One of which is a question. I have 2 questions. One for the medical side, one for the policy side and legal side. My adopted brother, he was adopted because he was orphaned by his mother who overdosed on Oxycontin. Contin, I'm not exactly sure how to say it. Econ student, not med student. So. But she was being prescribed for 6 years consistently, every 30 days, a 90-day supply of Oxy, I'll call it for now, with numerous overdoses, numerous times taken in for it. Never came back on the doctors. I'm not sure how, from a policy side, we justify that. But then on the the other side of that, I have a friend who is my age, 21, I think he's 22 now, who was pulled over and was found with 2 pills of unprescribed Oxy in the vehicle, which actually wound up being someone else's in his backseat, who got kicked out of the program he was in for school, lost his job making a sizable amount of money as a mechanic, and is now working as a cashier for the past 2 years, unable to find a job. So I guess my question on the policy side is, how do we justify our generation getting kind of overly, like you said, the pendulum swinging the farthest that way on our generation for the addictions of, I don't want to say the older generation, but the ones that came before us with that. And then my medical side of the question is, you kind of touched on it, but like, how can we train the medical students on not just like the ideas of pain and everything, but on prescribing things? I mean, we actually have legitimately, after she passed away, the mother of my adopted brother, a booklet of every prescription that she was ever written, and you can actually tell when, down to the date of when the doctor was on vacation, because you'd see a different person's signature on the sheets. So I don't see how that, like, going through med school all those years, you can then come out and be able to, with a conscious mind, or obliviously, I'm not sure which one it was, come out and be able to do that. I'm not sure if I made my questions clear, but yeah. But.
Yeah, so let me answer the medical side of it. So yeah, as I said before, and I'll be very blunt, when I first started as a primary care doctor in Boston's homeless population, many of my patients that I inherited from the previous doctor were getting 100, 200 milligrams of methadone a day for their chronic pain. Peter knows how high that is. So morphine, you name it. I inherited this panel of patients. And so they're all coming in every week, because you have to come in every 30 days, or 28 days to get your discharge. And so I'm like, doc, you gotta give to, you gotta give to. I'm like, okay. So most doctors are bad people. When a patient comes in, like if you know that feeling of somebody sitting next to you, desperate, you just want to make them better. And opiates don't just treat pain. Opiates make everything better. If you're depressed, they'll make you less depressed. If you're anxious, they'll make you less anxious. So I was one of those doctors who wrote plenty of prescriptions, and then when we realized, oh, this is what's killing our patients, completely transformed the way that I provided care, got trained, board certified addiction medicine. I just have a better understanding. And so what I would do with that kid or that person who was found in the car with the 2 pills, now I'm getting onto maybe the policy legal side of it, I would ask, well, why does he have these, right? Rather than criminalize him, say, oh, what's going on in your life?
How did you get them? Where did they come from exactly? Yeah.
Or, well, if they're not yours, tell me why you have them. Like, tell me more about your life. And usually, if you ask that question in a non-judgmental way, they'll say, honestly, I'm just going through a lot of stuff right now. That's my side.
Yeah, I'm not clear from your story whether was he prosecuted for having the 2 pills, and did he have a conviction?
Yes, there was no jail time served, but I think it was, I don't remember the specifics. He was 18 when this happened. He's 22
so he was
now.
convicted of
I think he
something.
was on probation for at least a year.
Okay.
Maybe
Well,
it was 18 months.
So, I mean, the part of my talk that I didn't give is about the collateral consequences of having a criminal record, and so, which is another huge area we work on, and so, 1 in 4 Americans now has some type of criminal record, and there are, the consequences are lifelong, and so, the policy recommendation there is to, drastically diminish the collateral consequences of having a criminal record, in addition to, not convicting as many people in the first instance, but people will lose their jobs and no one will hire them again, especially if you have a drug conviction for a number of years. And there should be more expungement of records. New York has a new law to seal certain criminal convictions, but they have to be at least 10 years old, which is a really long time. So that would be my policy recommendation for that.
Let me expand on that a little bit. So this is my specialty is crime control and punishment. And I think punishment's a perfectly good way to discourage people from doing stuff you don't want them to do. And it hurts, and that's too bad, but you need to exercise some control. But the first principle is that the efficacy of a punishment depends almost entirely on how quickly it happens after the offense. So all of these long time bomb collateral consequences are the worst possible form of punishment because they combine the maximum of damage to the person you're punishing with a minimum of deterrence for the activity you're trying to get him not to do. So what we need to do is front load the punishment system. And in fact, the people don't write about it this way. What New York has substantially done, I mean, everybody knows we got the crime rate way down in New York. What's less well known is that we did it while getting the incarceration rate down by 50%. What we've managed to do is substitute arrest for incarceration as a way of discouraging people from doing stuff. And that turns out, I think, to be a pretty good trade. But yeah, the collateral consequences are a catastrophe. And the other thing, the related catastrophe, is criminal justice fines and fees. So if somebody has a criminal conviction and winds up thousands of dollars in debt, and then there's no way you can earn an honest living because it gets garnished, so you've now committed into a criminal career. Complete insanity.
All right, well, there's so much to talk about, but it's 8 o'clock. So with that, that's going to conclude our panel. So one more round of applause.
Feel free, I mean, you can come up.
Yeah, right. We're around.
Talk to us individually.
Just as a closing note, Lydia from the Politics Society is here to talk about the policy case competition, which includes a topic on opioids. So Lydia, if you want to speak, then my students go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just speak really quickly. I know everyone has to run. It's after 8, but the policy.
Are there any more
competition
bananas,
is
do
an
you?
annual
I
policy
think so.
writing competition put on here at NYU. Our registration closes next week, and one of our topics is to discuss prescription drug prices. So if you're all interested in writing policy about how that intersects the opioid crisis or any of the other issues facing Americans today, please feel free to come on and talk to me.